Ready to roll? Okay, so now we are going to shift gears a little bit and talk a little bit about divorce and annulment. Okay, this is a very misunderstood aspect of the church and of church teaching and stuff, and so I think it's really good to have some good clarification as to what all the church believes and teaches and everything about this. So we're going to start this. You should all have this pamphlet, which was in your folders. And there is a little quiz in here. It's this little green section. It says which of these statements are true. It's a little true and false quiz. So we're just going to kind of do this little quiz together, okay? All right. So a divorced person is automatically excommunicated. True or false from the church? False. Okay? True or false? An annulment makes children illegitimate. False. Only rich people can get annulments. False. Protestant marriages aren't recognized because they are outside the church. False. Okay. Your former spouse has to agree before you can get an annulment. True or false? It's false. They don't have to agree. It just helps if they are cooperative. Okay? We'll explain that later. A marriage with children cannot be annulled. True or false? False. An affair is sufficient grounds for annulment. False. An annulment is just Catholic divorce. False. They're all false. So we will go through and explain why and what's going on with that. Okay, so marriage is a sacrament. If a sacramental marriage takes place, it is indissoluble. What God has joined together, no man can separate. Okay? So there's no such thing as divorce in God's plan. And Jesus says that when he answers the Pharisees in that scripture I read you earlier. Okay? And so the church upholds that because Jesus said it. Okay? What God has joined together, no man must separate. So if a sacramental marriage has taken place and is validly celebrated and all the right elements are there, then it cannot be separated by divorce. Civil divorce in itself is not a sin. So if there is a reason a couple needs to separate civilly, legally, that in itself is not sinful. That sometimes happens. I can give a specific example of somebody I know whose husband left her and she still loved him, wanted to reconcile, tried really hard, but he was kind of just having like a midlife crisis and went off on his own and unfortunately started going through all their money, right? And so she didn't want to divorce him because she still believed they were married and still wanted to reconcile, but he was not cooperating with that reconciliation process, and she had to do the divorce to protect herself and her children financially. Okay? So she worked with the priest, and he said, no, you have to do this for the legal purposes, for that legal protection. Sometimes when there's abuse involved, obviously, something like that. Okay, so there's different situations. Where we get into a sinful situation is when there's a civil remarriage after the divorce and an annulment has not taken place. Because what happens is the annulment says that the marriage was never sacramental in the first place. A sacramental marriage never happened, and then the person is free to marry again because that marriage that happened in the first place was not truly sacramental. And we'll explain why. Okay? So sometimes that happens, that people get into another relationship without seeking that annulment or not waiting till that annulment has been granted, and then they get into a sinful situation because what's happening is now they're in that next relationship, but they are still, in the eyes of the church, considered married to the other person because they haven't got the annulment. Okay? Christians in this situation who have received, or have gotten into another relationship and are waiting on annulment or whatever, and they're encouraged to still come and participate at Mass, but they should not receive Holy Communion if they're in a marriage-like relationship with someone, but not married to them because they haven't gotten their annulment. So they're still always welcome. That's why they're not excommunicated, Daniel. They're still always welcome as part of the church, and we encourage them to stay in close contact with the church, but they just are not able to receive communion. Okay, so what is an annulment then? Okay, like I said, if a valid sacramental marriage took place, it's indissoluble, meaning it can't be dissolved by divorce. But annulment is a declaration of nullity, meaning that there is some reason why the wedding did not result in a valid sacramental marriage. It would have been legal marriage, but not a sacramental marriage. Okay? So an annulment declares that after careful investigation, some reason prevented the marriage from being sacramentally valid. The sacramental marriage is declared null, and then those persons are free to marry sacramentally again if they choose to. Okay? And again, that doesn't mean that a valid legal marriage didn't exist. So therefore, any children of that marriage are legal and considered legitimate. So that gets to that question that we had in the... So the marriage of two baptized persons celebrated according to the norms of the church is always assumed or presumed to be valid. And so it's kind of like, you're presumed innocent until proven guilty. Well, it's presumed valid until proven otherwise. So the annulment process is the process of petitioning to present evidence that there was some reason that this marriage was not a valid sacramental marriage. So it is a court proceeding. We have what we call canon lawyers. Canon law is the law of the church. So we have lawyers, people who have been specifically trained in canon law, just like a person would go to law school and learn civil law or whatever, or criminal law. Well, we have church law lawyers. And so we would have someone that is called the defender of the bond. So that's sort of like the prosecuting attorney. They're on this thing saying this is a valid marriage. And then you have someone who is the advocate for the person seeking the annulment, who is trying to make the case that there was some situation or circumstance that caused it not to be a valid marriage. And so then a judge who is trained in canon law looks at both of those sides and makes a determination of the validity of the marriage. So that's kind of what the annulment process is like. Okay? So reasons a marriage might be declared invalid. First of all, lack of form. So this is a flaw in the marriage rite. So we talked about form and matter. So if the correct form was not used and validated, then that is that's like an open and shut case. It's like they didn't use the right form. So there's not a lot involved in that annulment process, okay? So what this is if a baptized Catholic gets married outside the church, does not come to the church, do the correct form, and have a priest or a deacon witness that form, then that marriage is automatically not valid. So we encounter this a lot with RCIA, and there are some people in this year's group who are in that situation. They're wanting to come into the church. They're married to a Catholic spouse, but they did not get married in the Catholic Church. So for their Catholic spouse was required to use this form to make it a valid sacramental marriage. So then they will go and meet with the priest, and they will redo their vows using the correct form with the priest present to make it a valid sacramental marriage, so that then they're in that correct marriage before they come into the church. Okay, so that's a pretty typical thing that we see a lot of times with people coming into RCIA who are married to a Catholic, and they might have gotten married in the non-Catholic spouse's church. Okay, and that is the most simple form of annulment because it's just a black and white situation. It wasn't done right. I do want to say, if two Christians who are both not Catholic, so let's say you have two people, neither of them's Catholic, but they're both baptized, and they get married, they are not bound by that form, okay? So they don't have to use those exact words, and it would be considered a sacramental marriage. because since they are not Catholic, they are not bound by the Catholic canon law, so they're not bound by that form. So again, that sometimes happens where I have people come and both of them are Christian, but neither of them was Catholic, and they were married. Theirs is considered valid already, and they don't have to do that form. Okay?
One is Catholic and one is not.
That's what I'm,
Okay.
yeah, so if they got married in the church with the form, it's good. If one is Catholic and one is not, but they didn't get married in the Catholic Church, then they have to have it validated with the correct form. Okay?
So that's what happened
Yes.
with me. So I got married, and my husband and I got married, and we got married at a justice of the peace, a regular wedding, like a big wedding, but I'm Catholic, he's not, and we were not married in a church by clergy. So it was simply, were you coerced?
Yeah, yeah.
It was a piece of paper. It still took a little time.
Yeah.
But it was literally a piece of paper that was like, they sent to my ex-husband and said, hey, did you coerce her? Did you beat her? Did you, like, they asked these questions.
Yeah.
And they asked also my witnesses. Was she coerced? Was she there of her own free will? Was this, and, was it in a church? And
Yeah.
they're like, no.
So if they are both not non-Catholics, they
Correct.
get married in their own church,
Mm-hmm.
but then they want to join the Catholic Church, do they have
They don't have to do anything
They don't have
because they both are they are both baptized, validly baptized Christians. They got married in their church. They're not bound by that specific form. We recognize that. Just like we recognize a non-Catholic baptism, which again, remember when we talked about baptism, we talked about the immersion, the 3 times immersion. Father AJ said you have to be immersed 3 times. And then I literally, guys, I went into a panic after that because I've been doing this for 20 years and I've never asked my non-Catholic, my people coming in who are already baptized, I get their baptismal record. I've never asked, is it 3 times? So I was like, oh my gosh, like have I brought all these people in thinking they were validly baptized? I literally sent a email to the judicial vicar, who's like the top judge of the canon law in our diocese, Father Stenger, and said, if they're coming in from another church, do they have to be dunked 3 times? And he's like, no. As long as the water pouring or immersion and the words were used, it's valid. So if a Catholic priest baptizes and he does the immersion, he has to immerse 3 times because that's what our ritual says. But we will accept from another church as long as it's water, immersion or pouring and the correct words. So the form isn't the same. They aren't bound by the same form of baptism that we are. So it's the same for marriage. They're 2 baptized Christians and they fully consented to each other, and so we'll accept that as valid. Now, if those 2 baptized Christians at some point become Catholic and they split up and they want to get remarried, they'd have to go through an annulment process. They wouldn't be looking at the form, but they would be looking at the circumstances of when they got married to see if that really was valid, the same way they would 2 Catholic people. So they can still have to go through an annulment process if they want to remarry. Because I've had that too, where I have a person coming into the church and their spouse is not Catholic but has been married before, and we need to get these 2 married. Their spouse, even though they're not Catholic, has to get the annulment to be free to marry this person. It's complicated. I know.
What if the other spouse got remarried? And like I still do an annulment? He's already married or something?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. And it's like a house of cards when you get like multiple marriages, because like if this person got married and they've remarried, divorced and remarried again, you have to go back to the first one and see if that was valid. Because if that was valid, automatically the next one's not, because they were never free to marry the second person. So it is. It's like, the more layers you get, it gets more and more complicated. So it is. It's really tricky. And so like I know like just this much, and so I try not to give like if people come to me and ask me like, you really need to talk to someone in the tribunal who knows all the things, like I know just the basics to get you started, and then I don't want to give too much like advice because it is very complicated. That's why people are trained as canon lawyers, like law is complicated, and so. Okay, so lack of form is the simplest. Other reasons a marriage might be declared invalid is there's some kind of an impediment which may cause the person to not be free to enter into the marriage. So what could those impediments be? The most obvious one is they had a previous sacramental marriage. So that's what I just said. If they were validly married to someone else, got civilly divorced, and then remarried, but they would ever sought an annulment and they go back and find out that one was valid, then they were not free to marry the second time. So then that was their impediment. They're not free to marry. Previous religious vows. So if someone takes religious vows, they are no longer free to enter into marriage. Now, religious vows can be released from those vows by their religious order, or even priests sometimes are released from the promises of their priesthood. There are some cases where priests have left the priesthood, that vow, and then gotten married, okay? But they have to be released from that to be free to marry before they do it, okay? A close blood relationship between the spouses would be an impediment. So obviously you can't marry your brother or your sister or your first cousin or whatever. So, okay. Then there are this is my language, I call it an indirect impediment. So it's something that a situation that existed that caused the person to not be free in a little different way. So like a psychological incapacity. So lack of maturity. So sometimes when young people are maybe pressured into getting married because the young lady got pregnant, something like that, and they really weren't mature enough to enter into that decision, but maybe the parents or whatever, or pressured them into it or whatever, that would be seen. And lots of other psychological things. And this is where annulments have been granted a little more generously in more recent times because we understand a lot more about psychology and psychiatry and state of minds of people. And so the really important thing, though, is everything that's being considered when you're looking at an annulment is the state of affairs at the time when the marriage took place. When those vows were made to each other, what was the status, the state of these two people that did this? Were they free to enter into that? Anything that happens later on is not part of it. Was it a valid marriage in the first place? That's what the annulment is looking at. So if everything was fine and everybody was completely psychologically sound at the time of the marriage, and then later a mental illness enters in, that is not grounds for an annulment. It has to be shown that existed at the time of the marriage, which made that person not fully free to consent. Okay? Intention by one of the spouses contrary to the marriage vows. In other words, they said the marriage vows, but they didn't really mean that. Okay? And I actually, again, a personal experience, I had a coworker when I first got out of college, my first job out of college. I had a coworker, she was a couple of years older than me, and she had just gotten married, and she was Catholic. I don't remember if her husband was Catholic or not, but he was Christian. They got married in the Catholic Church because her faith was really important to her. And part of the vows in part of the church promises that you make in the form of the church is promising to be open to having children. And that's discussed with the priest too before you get married. And so he agreed to that and said he agreed to that. And she found out later, after some months or a year or something after they got married, that he had gone without her knowledge and had a vasectomy because he really didn't want to have kids. So he obviously did not mean that promise when he said it. He was basically lying when he said his promises. So she sought the annulment on those grounds and received it because he did not, mean what he said and did not follow through. The church will not ever allow people to enter into marriage with a prenuptial agreement because that is contradictory to the promises you make of complete commitment and that idea that it's a covenant. Right? You're already putting in there an out clause, So you are specifically asked during marriage preparation if there are any prenuptial agreements, and you say no. But if you find out later that there was one, then that would be grounds for an annulment, okay? Because A, you had it, and B, you lied about it, right? Okay. Presence of a future condition for marriage. So if in one person's mind, they had this, let's say the husband, in his mind, thought, well, when we get married, when we have kids, my wife's staying home with the children. She's not going back to work. She's going to be a stay-at-home mom. And they either didn't discuss this or they discussed it and she agreed to it and then changes her mind. And he's like, no, but this is what we agreed on. We had, you have to uphold this. Well, that's like a future condition in the marriage, that you do have to work with things as things go along, right? So if they had that idea that this was what was going to happen and it didn't, and they think, and then force or coercion. Shotgun wedding, we've all heard that little term. That, it's not necessarily a physical shotgun, but there are obviously circumstances where people feel forced, and that was what Kristen was talking about in that paperwork. They were asked that question, were you coerced in any way, that sort of a thing. So,
Vicki, can I
yes,
just add a comment
yes.
here? Because I feel like this is where the biggest misperception is that people think an annulment is like an assessment of your marriage and the time it was married. You were married, right? But those things that we just discussed there, right? Again, everything in the annulment and the forms that get filled out and the questions and the things that they might ask, the other spouse or the family, whatever, is all about the time of the wedding or before the
leading up to it, and
right? It's
right.
nothing about like after that.
Right.
It's everything of, was that sacrament at that time valid or not, right? So I think that's the biggest misperception. I always hear people like, oh, well, I'm going to say you had an affair and like all these other things. Like,
doesn't matter.
That has nothing to
That has
do
no
with
bearing
the
on it.
sacrament of the marriage at the time it took place.
Correct.
So,
Correct. Okay. Hello. There's a spot right back there next to Linda. Okay. Let's see here. What's next? Why is this not changing? Oh, okay. And then there's something called a Pauline privilege. There's a Petrine privilege and a Pauline privilege, which there's some things in the pamphlet about them. Again, these are complicated. They're legal, so I'm not getting into a lot. But there are different situations depending on whether one or both of the persons that were entered into it were or were not baptized. Because remember, a sacrament, marriage as a sacrament is between two baptized persons. So when one or both of the people were not baptized, that's a different type of annulment situation. So, okay, so the parties involved in an annulment, so obviously they're divorced or separated persons, the woman and man who were married. Then there's an advocate, which typically is a priest or a deacon, but there can be other people who serve in that capacity, that represents the party seeking the annulment. So we talked about this as kind of like the attorney on their behalf that walks them through the process of all of the forms and paperwork and testimony and everything. And then we talked about this, the defender of the bond is the official person of the church court who defends the marriage and says, no, this was a legal marriage and or a valid sacramental marriage. And then the tribunal, which is the church court that views all the testimony and rules on the matter of canon law. And so that, like I said, there's judges in each diocese that are experts in the law and would review those cases and rule on them. Okay, and then automatically every annulment case, so like if we have an annulment case in this diocese, once it is decided on by the court, then it automatically gets reviewed by another tribunal in another diocese, like the archdiocese. So our archdiocese is Louisville. So they're always reviewed by a second court too. All right, any questions on that before we give our little intro? This is our, yes?
Automatically reviewed regardless of outcome?
Correct, yeah, they're always reviewed again, yeah.
So
it's like a-
in the event of an annulment decided on.
Mhm.
If they don't decide it, it goes up.
They would go, yeah, go review it. Anything else?
If
Yeah.
one spouse wants the annulment and the other says, I'm not participating in this kind of in spite of you, like
Right.
that person's
Yeah, and that was kind of one of those questions about the other person has to. So it does not require the cooperation of both, but it makes it go a lot easier if both people fill out the paperwork, because then you have all the testimony. But it can be granted on the testimony of just the one spouse plus other witnesses. So both do not have to participate or cooperate in the process, but obviously it would be much easier if you had the testimony of both. Yeah. And that does happen where people are like, yeah, I'm not.
yeah, like I know this is
Sorry.
important to you, so
Yeah.
I'm not
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Any other questions? That's a great question. Anything else like from that little quiz we took that you don't feel like we got answered any of those questions. Hopefully, as to them. Okay. All right. So next week, we're going to get a lot more into this, and we're going to talk about some of the tricky issues surrounding human sexuality and church teaching that are, again, often misunderstood and are very difficult sometimes for people to understand, accept, whatever. So we're going to get into that. So this, I'm just going to do a little small section here to kind of give us that introduction that'll lay the groundwork for having those discussions next week. While I start, if you wouldn't mind sending that around so that everybody can put their name tags in. Just noticed that there. So are you holding yours? Thank you. Okay. So human sexuality is properly ordered to marriage. So the sexual act is properly ordered to take place within marriage. And we talked about this earlier, about that being the bodily, the physical expression of the marriage vows and the consummation of the marriage vows, or of the marriage sacrament. Okay? So there are two distinct purposes that human sexuality has within marriage. The unitive purpose, which strengthens that bond of love between the spouses, and then the procreative purpose, which allows the spouses to bring forth life, or God to bring forth life through the spouses. And the church teaches that these two purposes should not be separated. This is going to be a key thing that goes back to a lot of the other teachings, is this concept right here, is that we have these two purposes and they should always remain together in the bond of marriage. Okay? The language of the body, this is something Pope John Paul II talked about a lot, and is this idea that the body is a sacrament of the person. The body is a visible sign of the invisible reality. So you all, as persons, are more than just what we can see in your physical body. Like, you have emotions, you have thoughts, you have, whatever that we can't see. But sometimes we get a vision into that through your physical body. So if Abby is angry, okay, I can see that. A sacrament of that is if she has a scowl on her face, she's, shooting daggers at me through her eyes, or if she picks something up and throws it at me or whatever, I can see by the actions of her body that she's angry, right? So our body is a sacrament showing the things that are going on inside of us, right? So what we do with our body is an expression of our whole person. And so in marriage, we should express with our body what we've expressed with those vows that we made in our wedding promises, okay? So the physical sexual relationship in marriage should express what a couple says in their promises, which should reflect the inner relationship that they have with each other, okay? This is why the sexual relationship belongs in marriage, because it expresses with the body the commitment and the unity that's been expressed verbally in the marriage promises. And to express that unity bodily without having made the promises is to speak a lie with our bodies. We're lying, we're saying, I'm giving my whole self to you, but you haven't done it yet in the marriage promises. Okay? So back to those two purposes, the unitive purpose, that love. Okay? So the grace of the sacrament of marriage is intended to perfect the couple's love for each other. Remember back to that quote from St. Thomas Aquinas, to love is to will the good of another. If I truly love my spouse, I want what is best for him or her. And what is the supreme good that I could ever want for my spouse? What is the best thing I could ever want?
That connection with Christ.
So a connection with Christ that's going to lead them to heaven, right? So that's what I want for my spouse. So everything I do together with my spouse we should be leading each other there. And then going one step further, we should be leading our children. If we're graced with children, if we're blessed with children, we should be leading them there too. That should be that supreme good that we wish for our children as well. Okay? So using that grace, they would help each other to attain holiness. That's what we're talking about, is you're both trying to grow in holiness together. Okay? So spouses are meant to lead each other to heaven. Okay? Then there's that procreative purpose, the life. Married love should bear fruit. Okay? Love is meant to expand outward. Just as God's love, that Trinitarian love, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit we talked about earlier, it's so powerful, it like expands outward, and that's why creation happens. That's why He created us, because His love needed to overflow to someone else, so it overflows to us. And so since our married love is supposed to be a model of that Trinitarian love, it should naturally want to overflow and bear fruit and expand outward. Christian married love is necessarily directed outside of itself toward others. Married couples live not only for personal growth, not only for mutual growth, but for something which is greater than themselves. Raising children is the usual and natural expression of fruitfulness in marriage, but not the only one. So there are times when a married couple is unable to have children of their own for various reasons, but they are still expected to bear fruit in the greater world. And I've seen that in couples that I know who are unable to have children and have fostered, have adopted, or not even with children, they go out into the community and serve in other ways that are bearing fruit in the community. Okay, they don't just stay turned in on themselves. The family is the domestic church. So the church begins in the family, where the moral and spiritual and faith life is passed on from the parents to the children. Okay, so that's an important part of our life as church, that we have that family unit bringing the church into the lives of those children. And then I kind of already mentioned this, marriages without children can and do bear fruit. So whether they never had children, weren't able to have children, or for people whose children, or after a couple's children are grown and have gone out into the world, then that couple can still bear fruit through other ways, through their children and grandchildren, even if they're not living at home, but then in other ways in the community. Okay? So I've mentioned a bunch of times that sexuality is intended for and protected by the marriage bond, okay? And so a friend of mine gave me this wonderful analogy, which I really love, years ago, to kind of help you understand this. So who likes a nice fire? Everybody's into fire pits these days. That's like the thing. Everybody's got to have a fire pit in there. Who has a fire pit at their house? Yeah? Okay, or we all like to gather around the fireplace in our living room. Probably some of you did that around the holidays, as you know, the chestnuts roasting by the open fire and all that good stuff, right? Okay, so that's great. What do we enjoy about the fire? It's warm. Who likes just like watching the flames, like just mesmerized by, the flames or whatever? Who likes to roast marshmallows or hot dogs over your little fire pit? So there's a lot of really cool, enjoyable things that we can do. And it usually, who has ever just sat by the fire all by yourself? Okay. But do we often do it like as a way, it's a place to gather, right? We have people gather around there with us too. So maybe you're just sitting there watching the fire, mesmerized, but maybe you're gathered with people having a fun time around that campfire or whatever. So a lot of cool things. Really good, all really great stuff. So now let's say we took this fire right here, and instead we put some logs on top of this little table in the middle of the room and we lit those up. Is that a good idea? So we'll all just sit around our family room and we'll just light it right, what the heck with the fireplace, let's just put it in the middle of the room. What would happen if we did that? There goes the house, right? The house, but it's a fire and it's got all those really cool properties. Why can't we just put it out in the middle of the room like where it's right in the middle of us? You need the form. Okay, because you need the protection of the fireplace, right? Our sexuality is a lot like the fire. It's a good thing. It's a beautiful thing. We can enjoy the warmth, the closeness, the bonding, even the excitement that it can bring. But if we take the fire out of the fireplace, if we take sexuality out of marriage and put it somewhere and then try to light it up, all kinds of bad things are possible to happen, okay? If without the commitment of marriage, that can cause hurt and heartache. it can often cause, one person might be using the other one just for physical pleasure, and that causes harm. Sexuality outside of marriage causes many destructive things in rape, prostitution, human trafficking. A child could be conceived outside of the marriage and then be deprived of the mother or father